Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Rivals in GT Sport of course, and this time we are pitching the recently added, in December at least, 2017 shape Ford GT against its lineage, the road-going versions, for the most part at least, of what was the GT40 and what became the GT, because ironically Ford did not have the rights to name the new one the GT40 again, but it's also kind of appropriate because it's not 40 inches tall anymore anyway. Now, the new car's great. There are some people who have had mixed feelings on it, but generally speaking, I think a number of us, myself included, have been very happy with it coming to Gran Turismo. I predicted it a number of times. It was such a clear, obvious choice of debut to bring to the game, and if not this game, perhaps the next one. So now that it is here, how does it compare to its lineage? But, as you could see from the title, we are not just going to compare it to the obvious choice of the 2005 Ford GT, which is an interesting battle in its own right, but I'm going further than that. I'm going way back to the OG, the GT40, the Mark I, from 1966. So this is going to be an interesting showdown. The cars have completely different specs, completely different engines, they come from totally different eras with very different ways of thinking. The GT40 is the bare bones classic by today's standards, the 2005 GT is a relatively simple approach at a supercar, and yet with about 60 horsepower less than an SLR McLaren or a Carrera GT, it's about as quick as those cars still in the mid-2000s, and of course now we have the newest GT, which is still kind of old school for a modern supercar, borderline hypercar, but at the same time doesn't have any of the hybrid or electronic additions of your McLaren P1s and LaFerraris and all that kind of stuff, but I would argue it's all the better for it. So, as I inferred, the question is, how do these three cars compare, and if possible, can we find the best one? Not just in terms of opinion, but which one, if any, is the clear winner of the three in terms of, for instance, value for money, which one is the quickest. Now, speaking to the point of which one's the quickest, to set a ground rule for this Rivals match, we've got to make it realistic. You can't just take all three stock cars against each other because of course the newest one's going to win. It's the fastest, it's as simple as that. So what I've actually done is tuned all three cars to the limits of N400. Now I've made the GT40 as heavy as it can be, and I've made the two newer ones basically as light as they can be, which brings all three cars to the region of 1230 kilos, or thereabouts. The power is of course around 440 horses because that's the limit of N400, and they are all using the same tyres. So to some degree, or at least as much as it can be, it equalises the three cars. So the GT40 is tuned up, and the new GTs are tuned down to make them all meet that same level. So, as we always do, I will first of all give my brief thoughts on each of the cars on their own, and then of course we will top trump style consider all of the specs of the cars in stock form, in tune form, to see if there is a clear winner. First up then, let's start with the latest incarnation, the 2017 Ford GT, completely different engine, in fact the first of these GTs to have a 6-cylinder, a V6 EcoBoost engine instead of the V8s, which is a little bit controversial, kind of like a mid-engine Corvette as the C8 is now, but as far as this car's all-round ability, it's a true supercar. There's no arguing that. Over 640 horsepower, it's not that heavy either, even though it is hefty compared to the other two. It is heavier, for instance, than the GT40, but at the same time, it's actually quite a lot lighter than the 2005, at 1,385 kilos. The power, as I said, is great, so when you put those two together, of course it's going to be a great car. In terms of how beginner-friendly it is, how user-friendly it is, well, the GT40 is known for being maybe a bit challenging, kind of like the Cobra and the Stratos, but also more competitive than they can sometimes be, considering its racing lineage. This one, I would say, is possibly considered usually to be the most forgiving, but I would actually give the edge to the 2005 out of these three. And of course we'll get into that more in just a second when I consider that car. In terms of value for money though, that is the biggest thing that it carries over from that vehicle because it's fantastic. The bang for buck is great, the value for money is great, the racing ability for the price is great. 550 grand is way less than the GT40, it is more than the previous GT, but even so 550,000 credits is not much at all. Really, for a supercar of this caliber, it's not quite as quick as your Veyrons and Huayras in a straight line, but around a track it can easily rival any of those, and you can tune it up to well over 800 horses, so it's got range as well. Plus, of course, you can detune it. And in terms of its overall lap time, the 2017 Shape 4 GT laid down a 131.641 lap of Laguna Seca. But what then about the 2005? Well, the 2005 Ford GT is a car that we've had a long time to ruminate with. It's one of those occasions where, much like the Veyron, it's had a very long and healthy lifespan with a ton of different exploits and variations that have come out. But with the Ford GT, the ironic thing is, it's not really Ford who have made all of these different variations. It tends to be these privateer racing teams or tuning companies that have taken the GT and made it absolutely crazy. Be it, for instance, the first car to actually break 300 miles an hour before the Veyron, or the Chiron, I should say, Longtail did, over a mile, I believe, something crazy like that, with a parachute on the back. Of course, you've got vehicles like the Avro 720 Mirage based on the GT, and even just in its standard form, it's a brilliant car. And one of the most curious things that I always felt about this particular GT is that Ford themselves said that it was designed specifically to rival Ferrari yet again, but on this occasion, instead of being in the racing world, it was designed to rival the 360 Modena in a production sense. And that seems weird to me, it always has, because it doesn't quite sit right. The 360 Modena and the Ford GT are just not on the same level. It's as simple as that. It doesn't even seem fair to the Ferrari. It's a great car in its own way, but it's no Ford GT, that's for sure, in terms of pure supercar level performance. However, this car is surprisingly forgiving in Gran Turismo Sport. It's easily a car which you could expect to be either really slippery or really heavy through corners, one extreme or the other, but when tuned for N400 as this one is, it's actually a walk in the park. And that's impressive given that, for instance, in its stock form, it is by far the heaviest of the three cars, 1,451 kilos, which, let's be honest, that's still not bad, especially for what it is, a supercharged 5.4 litre V8. It's a large vehicle, around 7 feet wide. This is no Lotus, but I would say that the biggest compliment that I could give to this particular generation of GT is how simple it is. Everything is exactly what it needs to be, and it's not overly complicated. There's no active aero, it's got a simple price tag of 150 grand, the handling does exactly what you'd want it to do, even the performance, there's not much fuss to it, it just gets the job done, and I think that's impressive. It's a refreshingly analog supercar in an era of the earlier 2000s where we were really starting to get into the more digital age with stuff like the Ferrari Enzo and then moving on to what we get now. This one was unabashedly and unashamedly old school, and I believe that just like the new one for its time, this is all the better for it as well. And incidentally, its lap time was a 133.152. So considerably slower than the newer one, but you would kind of hope so considering the leap in age and technology. But again, you've got to remember, they're both in N400, so the newer car has no power advantage. What then finally about the GT40, the car where it all began, the long-in-the-tooth predecessor of these two modern whippersnappers? Well, of course, it's a totally different machine, and it's far more removed from both of these than they are from each other. They are both very modern, but also very old school at the same time supercars, which can definitely rival the field, whereas back in the day, the GT40 didn't get as much of that chance. It was a fantastic race car, but on the street, just wasn't really a part of the picture. Stuff like Ferraris and the Lamborghini Miura and all that kind of stuff got way more press coverage. They're far more iconic from that era of street-going supercars, and yet this car is specifically known in GT Sport for being a brilliant high roller, because it is one. 2.8 million is a lot of cash, but at the same time you can earn so much more. As you can see on screen, I've done over 12,000 miles in this GT40, and the vast majority of that has been going around in circles, earning millions and millions of credits on Blue Moon Bay. So unlike the other two, you can earn that much more rapidly. Now the other two are great, so you can tune them to N400 and still win, but they just don't have the edge that this one does in N300. And at the end of the day, that N300 capability is not something to be sniffed at, because of course the GT40 does not have the upper end potential that they do. It's got nowhere near 800 horses, but at the same time, neither of those cars can go down into N300, so it's kind of give and take when it comes to how great they are. In terms of handling though, even without me really doing anything to it beyond just putting the power up to N400 and increasing the weight to make it fair, it feels great. This actually shocked me by how forgiving it was, and that's the one consistent thing in this particular game that all three Ford GTs have in common. They are nowhere near as challenging to drive as you could easily think. Now this one, for its age, I believe is the most impressive of the three in terms of the lap that it put down. It did a 132.288, and that is quicker than the 2005, but not as quick as the latest 2017 one. So in terms of lap, it's an interesting breakdown. 2017, then 1966, then 2005. But what about when it comes to the spec? Well, let's find out. First up then, let's consider the cars in their stock form. Now first of all, of course, we have the price, in which the 2005 is the clear winner. 150,000 credits is brilliant value that actually even undercuts stuff like the Porsche 911 for the most part. In terms of engine capacity, well, as I always make clear, these are top trumps rules where generally speaking, biggest is best. So of course the biggest engine is not always the best. The lap time definitely showed that, but for the sake of fun, we'll give it the point again with that 5.4 litre. As far as power though, it doesn't really matter because it swings straight back to the 2017 with 646 horsepower stock. In terms of torque as well, it may not be a V8, but don't be fooled, the turbo aspiration really makes up for that. 550 pound-feet of torque, which incidentally means that the torque on the latest car actually matches the horsepower figure of the 2005 car, which is pretty impressive. In terms of the weight though, well of course, the oldest car has the advantage. It's physically smaller, it's closer to a race car, there's less to it, less technological stuff, more analog. 1,080 kilos is very healthy. Now all three of them are pretty good, but that one is by far the winner. However, even though it is the lightest, the sheer power in conjunction with the middle of the three on weight gives the 2017 car the clear advantage there, with a very impressive 466 horsepower per ton. And finally, and kind of moving into the tune side of things, the range that each of these three cars has in terms of how many N classes you can get them into and thereby how much usability they have actually goes in a two-way tie between, interestingly, the 2017 car and the 2005, because both of those can go from N400 to N800, whereas the 66 car can go from N300 to N600. So not quite as strong a range, but definitely worth keeping in mind because neither of the newer cars can get into N300, as I said. So that's it as far as the stock numbers for the most part. Of course, the lap time is not included in the points as always, but how does it pan out for now? Well, for the moment, that means that the 2017 car is the winner. It has 4 points in its stock form, then 3 points for the 2005, and only 1 point for the original GT40. But could that change when they are tuned? Well, let's find out. Let's swap over the numbers to what they have when you fully upgrade them. Now, of course, the price doesn't change, so that's irrelevant to this point. Let's move to power. Interestingly, even though the stock power of the newest car is significantly higher, the tuned power of the 2005 is better. Not by much, only 2 horsepower separate to them, but I'm not surprised at that, to be honest. That V6 engine in the newer car does come across as kind of an engine that's set up in exactly the way it needs to be, and doesn't really need or want to be tuned that much. Whereas that 2005 engine, in a similar way to something like a Corvette LS unit for instance, it's begging to be tuned, it loves it. Supras, Skylines, Ford Cosworths, they've just got that kind of vibe where they love to be tuned and they relish it. That 2005 car definitely has that kind of feel, and it's enough to give it the point. Interestingly, in terms of torque as well, the 2005 car wins by a pretty significant margin, around 50 foot-pounds of torque more on that car than the still impressive 709 pound-feet on the newest version, and for both of these, of course, the GT40 trails way behind which is not really that surprising. In terms of weight though, speaking again of the GT40, this is of course where it claws back some points, because 950 kilos is fantastic when dropped, and of course the other two cannot match that. Both of them are pretty good in the 1200 to 1250 kilo range, but of course no way near the borderline LMP level weight of the GT40. But again, even though it's light, the lack of power is not enough to give the GT40 the horsepower per ton point. It once again, interestingly, goes to the newest car. The 2017 car has 700 horsepower per ton on the dot to the 670 of the 2005 car. So how does that actually pan out in terms of tuned points? Well, in the stock setup, we had 4 points to 3 points to 1. Now, in favour of the 2017 car, we have 1 point, not that strong. The 66 GT40 has 1 point, also not that strong, but interestingly, the winner when tuned is the 2005 car with 2 points. So not a huge margin, but a win nonetheless. And that means that if you factor in both the tuned and stock total range that these cars offer, from their lowest class to the highest class, their stock numbers and their tune numbers, everything all put together, that means that we have a tie between the 2017 and the 2005, both of which get 5 points to their name, and then the GT40 trails behind with 2 points. Interestingly, the GT40 is the car that is kind of the most consistent, because the only 2 points that it gets are both the weight. It's the lightest stock and the lightest tuned, and that's it. However, many of you know how much love I have for the GT40, because it's such a great cash cow in the game. Overall, my thoughts are that the newest of the three is my favourite purely for its driving fun. I would say that the 2005 car is the best for sheer tuning ability, and it's by far the fastest of the three in a straight line, with around a 30 mph top speed advantage. Yes, it really is that different. And of course, the classic GT40 is an iconic collector's piece, but more importantly, it can earn its own money back and then some, time and time again, thanks to Blue Moon Bay, and so can the other two, but you don't earn quite as much. Overall then, that's it for this Rivals Showdown, a very interesting match with quite an interesting outcome as well. Despite certain cars have certain advantages, the difference between points and sometimes even specs isn't quite as broad as you might think. But overall, that's it for this match. Of course, I will see you guys next time, and which is your favourite of the three? Tell me about it down below, and until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.